Hello, David, and welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Avish. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in. You and I have known each other for a number of years, so I know all about you. But for the people who are listening and are unfamiliar with you and your work, could you just give us a quick, 30-second, 1 minute sort of bio resume of kind of you and what you do?
Yeah, definitely. All about practical tools for human-centered leaders. So, helping leaders get transformational breakthrough results and doing it in a way that creates a climate where people grow, thrive, and enjoy and love their work. So, that's ultimately what our business and company are all about.
Okay, and just for context, you said what our business is about. So you've got a unique business structure. Not unique, but you've got a different type business structure that some people would envy and some people would be horrified by. So why don't you just so people know when you say our what you're talking
Oh,
about?
sure. Yeah, when I say our, I'm the president of Let's Grow Leaders. And so my wife and partner in life and business and authorship of books and so forth, Karen Hurt, is the CEO. And so together we run the company. It's a global leadership development firm. And so when I say our, I'm typically referring to all of us, but in particular, Karen.
Gotcha. Absolutely makes sense. So you are the president and she is the boss. Understood.
Hey, division of labor, division
All
of
right,
labor.
and so you mentioned also in your partner in authorship, and you guys together have written three books, correct?
That's correct. Yes, a couple independents. Well, no, there's a fourth one if you count the children's book. We wrote a fantasy novel with our son called Glowstone Peak that was really about leadership for kids.
All right, well, we're gonna circle back to that. Anything fantasy novel related, we have to talk about. Uh, but just real quick, because we are gonna talk about we're gonna kind of focus this conversation on your third most recent book. But just again for context, I'm sure some of it'll come up. Could you just tell us briefly about the other two books?
Yeah, for sure. So the first that we wrote together is called Winning Well, A Manager's Guide to Getting Results Without Losing Your Soul. So it's a lot of those foundational management leadership fundamentals
Mm.
that are really practical skills that a lot of people don't learn. And so that book is filled with those. Then the next one is Courageous Cultures, How to Build Teams of Micro Innovators, Problem Solvers, and Customer Advocates. And that's really about building an organizational culture where everybody is coming to work every day and able to speak up, solve problems, share their ideas, and creating that kind of mass innovation. We call them micro innovations that every team and every organization needs if they're going to survive and thrive. And so those are the two predecessors. And now our latest that I think we're talking about today, Powerful Phrases for Dealing with Workplace Conflict. And this one is really, if the first one was written for leaders and managers and the second one was written for executives, this third one is written for anybody who works with another human being.
So gotcha. So almost everyone, other than those of us who prefer to be recluses and have solo businesses and not interact with people except when we absolutely have to. But even then, based on
Even
something I read in
then,
the book, it would be useful even for someone like me.
I when I was first self-employed, Avish, I always said I had a jerk for a boss. So
It's true, and you actually have stuff in here about talking to yourself. A lot of it, and I like that. A lot of it is, it's not just. But I'm jumping ahead because uh, I want to start with some foundational stuff because through this, I do see a lot of kind of connections, not overlap per se, because you and I and Karen, we kind of talk about different things, but there's a lot of kind of connections between the yes and the stuff I've seen there. But before we jump into some of that, the idea here, when you see a title like Powerful Phrases for Workplace Conflict, you sort of assume, all right, this book is going to show me how to avoid conflict. But reading it and talking to you, that's actually not really. I mean, obviously, we don't want like unnecessary conflict, but one of the premises that you have is that workplace conflict is necessary, and this is not about avoiding it, but how do you kind of deal with it and almost initiate it when needed.
yeah, exactly. Conflict's unavoidable. I mean, if we have people who care and we have differences of opinion, we should have conflict. We're going to have conflict. The Nobody needs that what you were saying earlier, like that destructive conflict. I think when a lot of us think about conflict automatically, it kind of get tense and it gets it's that destructive conflict that we're talking about. But when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about really cool conflict and the yes and of everything, right? That's where you get this different ideas coming together and you get something better that's a better result than if I was doing it by myself now that I'm doing it with two or three or four or 500 other people.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was just doing I did a keynote yesterday, and I talked about this idea. I was talking obviously about yes and yes but, and how about kind of resisting change and putting off things, and how that the famous cliched phrase about how a hero dies one death, a coward dies a thousand, and I was talking about it in the context of, hey, there's this change, I'm going to resist it, but it applies to a conflict almost the exact same way. It's like there's a situation that's bothering you, someone said something or someone has a behavior, and for so many people, myself included, because I'm definitely a conflict avoider in my life, where it's like, let's just put it off. Maybe it'll fix itself, or it's not worth it. If I go talk to him, it's going to make it much worse. So I assume that's one of the reasons you sort of developed this book. You were seeing this sort of behavior a lot, whereas your position is taking action to initiate that discussion in the long run is going to be much more positive.
Can be. It can be,
Well, yeah,
absolutely. And
that's
the can
fair.
be, the qualitative can be is we got to have the tools for it. So why do so many of us naturally kind of steer clear of conflict? And I've definitely have been that person as well, Avish. So you're not alone there, right? There's so many of us for whom that's true. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's the people who like, their way of avoiding it is I'm just going to overpower it. And, with anger or some of those negative things that just like, if I can keep people away from having to have the real things that are meaningful and potentially uncomfortable, either way, we're not solving any problems. And so why do we do that? Well, like you said, we fear damaging relationships. We're social creatures. We want to be in relationship with people. So, we need the tools to be able to do that in a way that builds those relationships and helps us actually solve and resolve those problems and come up with better solutions. And if we can do that, our quality of life improves, the quality of our work improves, our careers progress, whatever it is that we're about, it's better if we get the skill to do it.
Yeah, and I have this. I'll throw this metaphor at you that I sometimes use. Is I kind of equate it to a rubber band. Like we're all sort of like rubber bands, and what happens is it stretches to a point and then comes back when we don't deal with it. Stretches to a point and then comes back when we don't deal with it, till eventually it stretches so far that it snaps. And I think one of the things these tools are, so you avoid overstretching your rubber band. It's like instead of avoiding it till it stretches so far you can't avoid it. Like, okay, how do we deal with it in a productive, positive manner?
Yeah.
And there's a stat in here in your book that you said in the book. This might be shocking, which and it was. And I'd like you to talk about it and maybe what the source is, because I was too lazy to click on the footnote, and maybe you can share it for you. But you literally said in there that, and you did a survey of like 5,000 people around the world, you and your company, and you found that 70% of let me see if I'll go. Seventy
Yeah, I can
percent
give it
of
to
your respondents said they're experiencing more conflict at work than
the
how many.
same or more as in the last couple of years. So yeah, the global is a world workplace conflict and collaboration survey. So 5,000 people, 46 countries around the world, all 50 U.S. states. And so yeah, we started by asking them, what is the extent, what kind of the changes in the amount of conflict are you experiencing? And so yeah, 70% of respondents around the world, it was pretty consistent from country to country, said they are experiencing the same or more amount of conflict as they did over the previous couple of years. Which that's interesting. Like, okay, so if it feels sometimes, if you're in the workplace, and you're like, wow, there's more conflict, it feels that way. Well, you're feeling something that a lot of other people are feeling. But what I found most fascinating was in the 30% who said they're experiencing less. Like,
Hmm.
okay, let's dive in there. Because then the next question we said, well, why? Why are you experiencing more? Why are you experiencing less? And the people who said they're experiencing less, half of them said it's basically because they have escaped a negative situation. Either they left a
Wow.
toxic, conflict prone workplace, or maybe now they're working from home and now they're just not interacting with people as much, which that's great for them. Maybe they're having a more peaceful existence. But what is lost in all of that is all of the positive outcomes and things that we could get if we were having positive, good, healthy interactions with people. So, even in that 30% that are having less conflict, half of that isn't necessarily positive.
That's it is really amazing, doing the work that we do. How like mind-numbingly obvious it is. You ask anyone, like, is your work going to be better? Is your workforce going to be better if people interact more positively, are more supportive, less toxic, whatever? I would guess almost universally 100% of people would say yes. And yet, when it comes to actually engaging in the behaviors that's going to lead to that, I mean, maybe 70% or whatever it is, it's like huge, and probably more than 70%, because those 30% who are doing better, a lot of them it's because they're no longer in those situations. Like it's just one. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why people like you and I will have work for a long time, because of stuff that just because something is obvious when you're looking at it from 30,000 feet when you're in the weeds. And I think that's what's cool about this book is it kind of, I would say the first third or so is sort of strategic mindset overview, but then you get very tactical. It's not just like, all right, now go engage. It's like, all right. And I think I counted like 25 different chapters, each of which is a different scenario. Like if you have a toxic boss, or how do you, if someone you felt you're not getting enough credit from your boss, or if you have a coworker who's taking advantage of you. So let's talk a little bit about that, about the foundation strategy. Unless you wanted something to add to that. I
Well, yeah, I just wanted to call out what you were saying there because I think it's so true that the things that we want, we don't always take action on. And there's a difference between, oh, that would be nice, and I really want it and am willing to do the thing that's going to get me there. And I think about, just a practical, easy example. You see somebody who's like pretty fit and buff, and so we're both guys, and we're like, okay, there's somebody who's fit and buff, and like, God, I'd love to look like that. Well, if I really want to look like that, what I'm saying is I want to put in the hard work at the gym and with the broccoli, chicken, rice, and protein shakes or whatever it is that, and just for the record, for those who might be listening and not watching this, I am not super buff. I have pretty good shape, relatively speaking, but no, I'm
and I would
not.
say, for the benefit of those who are listening and not watching, I am super buff. If you are listening
This
and
is
not watching.
I know I'm supposed to yes and that, Avish, but at any rate, yeah, totally. So, but you know what I'm saying, right? It's that like, it's nice. That's a nice thing, but do I really want what that takes? And that's why we provide these practical tools, is because so often we don't see the path to get there. And so it's really our heart is to provide you, the listener, with the tools to help you have those conversations. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings along those lines is, if you want to see what a person truly values, look at how they spend their time and how they spend their money. And I think it's, we can use that as individuals and as an organization. Like, yeah, I'm joking about my fitness. Like, obviously, it's been a goal of mine for 40 years, and it's. But yeah, if I look at how where do I spend my time and my energy and my money, it's not necessarily on those things, right? It's much easier to not do. And I think that's why, your second book was about courage, and in this book you touch upon that. And so we're talking about kind of the mindset, the foundational piece to start. Like, there is a bit of courage, I would call it like saying yes and stepping out of your comfort zone a little bit. So what do you see when you're working with people in terms of like the initial hurdle to actually apply some of these techniques? Because even though you lay out what they can do, there's got to be some resistance still.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the first conversations, why, and as you were saying, the first third of the book or the first two sections are really about that foundation. And the first conversation, the first phrases aren't with another human being, they're with yourself. And it's that conversation, as you were mentioning earlier, that you have with yourself about, why does what I have to say matter? And what's at stake if I stay silent? And in getting in touch with your own values and what's actually at stake and what you're trying to achieve. So much of this is reframing. When we think about, let's take if you're a manager or a leader, or you don't have to be. Let's say you're a team member and you got another team member who's slacking, and you're like, I need to have an accountability conversation with that person. Well, if you're coming at it from the mindset of, I need to go beat that person up in order to make them perform, well, of course that's going to be negative, and who wants to do that? And of course that's going to damage your relationship. But if you come at it with the mindset of service, of, you know what? Never once have I brought somebody a cup of coffee, like, hey, here's a cup of coffee for you. And not once have I ever been nervous about that. I've never worried about, what are they going to think of me? Or is our relationship going to be okay? Whatever. Because I'm bringing them something that I know is helpful and useful for them. Now, maybe they hate coffee and they're like, oh, no, I'm good, man. Thanks. It's their choice if they drink it or not. But in me approaching it, that's a mindset shift, is recognizing the value of whatever I have to say and contribute, and coming to it from that perspective of, I really care about our relationship. I really care about the work we're doing here. I really care about whatever is at stake if I don't say something. And so getting in touch with that and having that conversation with ourselves is kind of the first step to starting to take action and have some of these conversations.
I like that. I never really thought about it in the context of thinking of that kind of broaching that conversation with the perspective of, I'm offering you something, I'm helping, I'm not. Because it is easy to think of it as criticism. Like, I'm going to come and tell you what you're doing wrong and how you need to fix it. But if we think about it more, it's like, oh, I'm here offering you something because I want to help this. I could see that really lowering that resistance. I have not no magic wands here. Nothing's going to suddenly make you super excited about it, but just lowering that
And
resistance.
there's research that goes into this too. So like if you as you're starting one of these conversations, and you'll see in our phrases, right, that there's so many ways that we suggest to do this, but if you can open a potentially difficult or challenging conversation with your intent, and the two research-based things that make conversations more likely to be productive is one, if I can start with my intent for that conversation. So like if you and I were having a conversation and and you had not called me back and followed up on a commitment you made, and I was like, hey Avish, my intent for this conversation is I really want to make sure that we're keeping our mutual commitments to each other and that we're eliminating any friction that's going to keep this project from getting done. When I start with that intent, that gives you a chance to enroll in that conversation with me and say, yeah, I want those things too. All right, let's talk about it. As opposed to my intent is to make you feel bad about yourself or to beat you up or any of those kinds of things. My intent is to help in some fashion. So what is that specifically? So if we can start with our intent, that's always going to provide in a research-based way, HB articles, all the rest of it, but the research-based way of opening the door to a more meaningful conversation.
And it's so interesting you said, because I'm literally right now in the middle of right now in the middle. It's been like a month because I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but I'm working on an article or a blog post on Hanlon's razor, which is this saying that never never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence.
Love
And
that. That's
I
so
love
important.
that because it's like so many times we assume someone's doing something to hurt us when it's like, oh no, they just had no idea. And what I like about this approach of starting with intent is it takes that completely away. Because when you start with intent, like Hanlon's razor happens because we have no idea why they did what they did, so we assume it's because they're jerks or they're mean. And when you start with intent, it takes away all the ambiguity, um, which goes into one of the four dimensions that you talk about. So let's this is a nice kind of segue into that. So again, kind of in the when you before you get into the specific phrases, you lay out four different sort of dimensions of I forget the exact phrase of
Yeah,
good.
four dimensions of collaboration. And what these are, if you think about these as there's two levels to look at them. One is foundational. If I can invest in these four dimensions of collaboration in our relationships, the more I invest in these, the less destructive and dumb conflict I'm going to have. And
Mm-hmm.
those are the things we want to avoid. And the more meaningful and constructive conflict, or another word for constructive conflict is collaboration. The
Yeah.
more collaboration we're going to have. And so these four dimensions are connection. Do we know one another as human beings? Clarity. Do we have a shared understanding of what success looks like? Curiosity. Are we genuinely open to other perspectives and what's possible? And then commitment, which is do we have a shared agreement moving forward? And so those four, and we can talk about how you get into them and all that, but those four, if we're doing that before there's any kind of conflict, the conflicts we do have will be less severe, less destructive, more collaborative. But then there's another way to engage in those four dimensions, and that's when we're in the middle of an actual conflict conversation, we can take a look and say, okay, which of those four is hurting here? Which of those four is, if we're having a conflict, there is probably one of those, or maybe all four of them, but at least one of them that is suffering in some way. And so that's a place to focus our conversation and our phrases and some of the things that we want to explore. So like, for example, if we have a conflict and it's like, gosh, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. We're working from two completely different playbooks, two different scripts. I thought our boss asked for this. You thought they asked for that. All right, that's clearly a clarity issue. So how can we have some conversation to resolve that? So that's an example of how we might use those dimensions to diagnose the conflict when we're in the middle of it and then work our way through it.
And do you feel like they're all equally weighted, or do you feel like there's one you should start with and then kind of explore the others? Or
This depends on context. And so much of our work that we do is with leaders and managers. So if I was coaching a leader, if I were coaching a leader or manager who is very new to their role, I might start by advising them to start connecting, meet the human beings on your team, get to know them, and so forth, help them get to know you. Then I'd say move to clarity, like start establishing what does success look like for our team. as you talk to people, what is that shared vision of what's possible that we collectively think we can do and what we're capable of? And then, as you get curious and committed and so forth, and then you work your way through it. Commitment is generally the last step in of this four.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, but it's generally the fourth one in the process. But it's that process of how are we holding ourselves accountable? How are we making those agreements to move forward? And like you're getting really practical. I have a great conversation before we were on air. We're like, oh, let's talk about this
Yeah.
potential game activity that you want to create for your business and so forth. Well, that's a nice intent, but if we're really committed to that, we would schedule a time on the calendar and say, all right, let's move that from just a nice idea to let's schedule the finish on that, put it on the calendar. Like there's some phrases you can use to make those kinds of agreements. So that's how I would approach it. Again, context is really important
Right.
though.
Obviously, every situation is going to be, but for someone who's kind of new to this, like they want to start using it. So I like kind of that approach. Connection, especially for new people, connection's a good place to sort of start, and you kind of quickly figure out. You should be pretty obvious if you have these in mind. You should be able to pretty quickly, if you've got a conflict, figure out which one is sort of deficient or
Yeah,
ones.
and if you don't know, there are some questions you can ask to quickly find that out. And so, like even when we're talking about connection, let's say that you and I are in different departments, and we don't really have to work together much, but all of a sudden we got thrown together. Something's not operating correctly. I don't know you, you don't know me, so we're not really connected. A way to invest in that connection right away when we're having the conflict conversation is back to our intent. Hey, you know what? My intent for this conversation is I really care about you having a good experience here, our team getting what they need. Hey, can we talk about this? My intent is to make sure this works out smoothly for both of us and we both get what we need out of the relationship here and both come out looking good. How's that sound for you? And as soon as I do that, that's my intent and I'm inviting your intent. Boom, we've created some connection there on a shared purpose for that conversation.
Yeah, it's well, I gotta keep saying the same thing like about how great it is. So let's you probably never get tired of that, but let's move forward on these. So you got four dimensions, and then you have a section in the book you call GOAT phrases, which for those who don't know, GOAT is an acronym for greatest of all time. Although I don't know if there's a way for you. We're around the same age. When I was growing up, when I was in high school and college, like being the goat was a negative. Like the goat was like short for the scapegoat, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, the goat. We're like, wait, that's a good thing now. So it's
Well,
like,
there was also, depending on where you went to school, so this will tell you a little bit. I grew up in Colorado, and some of the more suburban or rural schools, the goats were talking about like goat herders or goat farmers, and so yeah, it was also a negative in that
oh,
context. Didn't get to be a positive until a little bit later, coming out of the sports world and so forth. But as we were putting these together and identifying what are the phrases that we just feel are transferable. You can use them in almost any situation. They're going to work about 100% of the time. And gosh, these are the best phrases. And as we're kicking around, what do we want to call these? And our son, our teenager, who just now is enrolled in college, but he was a junior at the time when we were writing the book. And everything at that point, you know how kids are. He's like, "That's goated, man. That's the
yeah,
goat." Everything was goat this, goat that. I said, "Okay, well, tribute to Sebastian, we're good. These are going to be the goat phrases." And
I
so
love it.
now we have actual goats. So illustrated goats in the book. We have giant goat cutouts that go on stage with us at time
Oh,
from
do
time
you?
to time.
That's
Oh
fantastic.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so for those of you listening, in addition to the book, from the beginning, but David and Karen also speak and trade and keynote. So if you wanna have a keynote, we have cut out goats on stage. So if you have a goat theme for your conference, unequivocally, you got to call David. But even if you don't, he would do a great job for you. Um, and I got a kind of side note. I was very jealous because talking about goat phrases. One of the blurbs for your book is from Seth Godin, who says this book is worth it for the goat phrases alone. And Seth is like, mega best-selling author, mega speaker, one of my favorite sort of thought leaders and content experts. And you got him on your book saying that like this one section alone is worth the book. So that's pretty high praise.
Yeah, we were pretty honored and pretty thankful when he said that. I thought that was pretty cool. So we're grateful for the endorsement in general, but calling out those specifically, thought pretty awesome. And I believe it's true. I mean, if I had
Yeah,
to,
it's
there's over 300 phrases in this book, but if I had to only like memorize 12, those would be the 12.
so let's talk about them a little bit. We're not going to go through all 12. One, because it would take too long, and two, because the book is a great read. So if you want all 12, you should definitely, pick up a copy of the book and check it out. So I'm thinking maybe we'll just talk a little bit about, let's kind of touch upon a goat phrase for each, because you have three for each of the four dimensions.
Mhm.
And so I kind of picked my favorite of each group. So for connection, I just love the tell me more,
Yeah.
and I talk about this a little bit with yes and, where it's like, yeah, but let me tell you what I think. It's like, no, yes and tell me more, and I love this, and let me know your thoughts if this is what you're thinking. Is even say tell me more when I'm curious. Obviously, like, oh, you said something interesting, tell me more. That's the easy one. What I would think the more powerful one is when you say something I disagree with, instead of me jumping in with yeah, but let me tell you what's wrong. It's like, well, all right, well, tell me more before I start responding.
Avish, everyone always wants to know, okay, wait a minute, you are married and you write books together and you run a business together and so forth, and you're like writing about workplace conflict. Like, how does this work in your life? Do you use these phrases? And I will tell you that I have specifically, since we wrote the book, been working myself on how I use these phrases. And tell me more. It's funny that you chose that one. Of a couple of these goats, tell me more is one of the two or three that I have really tried to invest some time in. And you're exactly right that when I feel myself start to tense up at what somebody is saying because I think they've misjudged me, I don't like the way, whatever it is. If I can say, okay, I acknowledge those feelings, and as they finish saying whatever they're saying, take a breath and then say, can you tell me more?
Mm,
It helps them. Why is this a connection, greatest of all time powerful phrase, GOAT phrase? It's a connection phrase because it's communicating, I genuinely want to hear what you're saying,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to getting defensive, all the other things. And I have my perspective and I have all my emotion. I got to deal with all that. But if I can start with tell me more, then I'm bringing them in, and it's a heart thing. I really want to hear where you're coming from. And when I say tell me more, the other thing that happens is a lot of times you get beneath whatever the surface issue
Mm-hmm.
was, just automatically as people tell. And so I love to tell me more until there's nothing left to tell. Okay, now I can start taking the next step and get into some of the other goats. But it's powerful for that reason.
Yeah, and having that sort of discipline to not let the emotion. I want to talk about that, but I have a side question. Since your wife co-authored this book with you, she knows you're using a goat phrase when you're using it. Does that ever make her like kind of roll her eyes or be like, "Hey, you're like," or is she like appreciate it? Like, okay, you're like really trying to like it's
I'm
like sort of like
going
the
to
magic trick. Does the fact that she knows you're using a technique make it less effective, more effective, or neutral?
I am going to go out on a limb here because that is a question we have not discussed. And now that you've asked that, I'm like, I got to ask Karen that question. Um, Here's what I would say. I don't even know that she sees it when it happens because we're in the middle of a conversation. And so and this can be anything at work. She has an idea and, oh, okay, tell me more about that. If I can go there first, as opposed to I'm an operations guy, so I'm immediately the one that wants to say, here's the 10 reasons that won't work
Yeah.
and what we need to solve, blah, 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 blah. But if I can start, hey, tell me more. She's so ready to share the rest of that idea. I don't even know that it registers that I'm goading, and doing
I think
that.
that might be why this was the one like of my favorite phrases, kind of like you said, is for yours, because it is so simple and conversational. It's not like a corporate buzz phrase or like a technique. It's just tell me more. Like it's so it is very very. It's a real natural way to flow into it.
And here's
And
the other
so
thing I would say. I'm going to say that, Avish, from my perspective, is when she uses a phrase, I am grateful for it because it's connected and I want to get my opinion out. And so if we're in that conversation, if for the rest of our life, if you say, tell me more, or use one of these other goat phrases, I am never going to resent that as, oh, he's using a technique. No, it's you're communicating and truly connecting and want to know what's going on. So uh, I totally get what you're saying. There are some of those where you're like, oh my gosh, they're doing that therapist thing or that kind
well,
of
I think
stuff.
it
And
also
that's
comes back to intent because, I once posted on like I don't know some social media like TikTok or something, a little video or something about using yes and one of the comments someone posted was like, "Oh, the salesman once was trying to use this on me and it was just so like annoying." I'm like, yeah, it's because their intent wasn't like to really yes and you. Their intent was to sell you or to placate you, or because they learned it in a class as a technique. I think telling me more is like that as well. Like, and you have a chapter in the foundational before you even get into this. I think you have a chapter in there, a section about like mindset and intent and tonality, and like the they are goat phrases, but even as a goat phrase, if it's said with the wrong intention or tonality, it's gonna fall flat.
Yeah, oh, there's a world of difference between, Avish, tell me more, and tell me more. That's like
Exactly.
totally different things, right? And that's true for so many of these is where's the sincerity of your heart? And listen, I'm a human being. I want to be real about this, right? Is I get worked up, I get fired up. I hate being misunderstood. Like that's one of my Achilles heels. I feel somebody's misunderstood me.
Yep.
I'm like, no, and I like fire up and all the rest. But even in that, when I'm feeling that way, I can still say, okay, tell me more. I really do want to know. I, I'm suffering right now, but I really do want to know so that we can work through this in a positive way. Or another, and I don't know which one you chose in the curiosity thing, but I'm curious how this looks from your perspective. That's one of my favorite ones.
Mm.
Um, and that one is another one that I can say in all sincerity, even when I'm not really feeling it, and it helps get me out of that kind of mental state, loosens up that my amygdala isn't as seized up anymore. And so I want to be real about this. This doesn't mean that I'm always like in some kind of, or that, listener, that you're in some kind of Zen state where you're like, oh, I am even keeled and I am just conflict
Oh
pro. And
yeah.
like, that's not what it's about.
And so before we move into the next one, then I think one thing that came up here that is something I talk about a lot, and it's a whole chapter in your book. And I to me, I think this is even more important than most people. Um, I think people underlook this in our modern world, and that is the role and importance of emotions. And we've already talked about like when I feel defensive or when something makes you. And so you have a chapter called Beyond the Drama, De-escalate emotion. To me, it's all emotion. Like, and I think it drives performance, it drives creativity, and when you think about relationships, which is kind of what communication's all about, like really, relationships are just emotions. It's my relationship with you is how I feel about you and how you feel about me. Um, and so many of these phrases are harder to implement for us, when we let our emotions go, they're going to be less effective. The other person's high emotional state. So, could you talk a little bit about kind of how you've seen the role of both emotions and the powerful phrases and how you kind of manage that?
Yeah, so often when our emotions are flaring up, and I'm talking about the ones that we feel like don't help us contribute to collaborative situations. Like I'm getting angry, I feel disrespected, I'm feeling misunderstood, I feel unsafe, that my safety's at stake. This is not going to work out for me. This can keep me from getting promoted or lose my job or whatever. Any of those things that I'm feeling, when I'm feeling that way, I'm going to have an emotional response to that doesn't help the conversation. So I need to be aware of those for myself and figure out, okay, what's going on here, and use some of the questions that are there to start getting into that for myself. But even more importantly is paying attention to what's happening for the other person or the other people. And if I'm seeing some of those responses there, to go there. And I use a phrase, reflect to connect. Like if I'm seeing somebody in a one-on-one accountability conversation, for instance, where my intent is to help them succeed, and they're firing up, they're like, I don't know what's wrong. Why do you keep busting my chops about this? And then to like approach it with compassion and say, I'm noticing that that you're standing up, that you're pacing, that your voice is louder. Sounds to me like you're really upset and frustrated here. Is that right? Like, here's the emotion I'm picking up. Do I have that right? Just to see the person that way. I'm not telling them how they feel. I'm asking. Here's what I'm picking up. Do I have that right? And then back to, can you tell me more? Can you tell me what's happening for you right now? And those kinds of things immediately start to de-escalate because I'm reestablishing safety because I really do care I care about and I honor the other person's emotions and what's happening for them. And in doing that, that lessens some of that intensity of
Mm.
whatever's going on and establishes some way for us to have some conversation going forward. And I've had some crazy ones of those in the past where I've seen that these techniques, they really do work because, again, you got to come from a sincere place. And I think the biggest challenge for me in these is I want to see the other person. I want to be seen myself too.
Yeah.
So it's balancing that and making sure that as we're having that conversation, we're establishing it so to say, okay, here, what's your concern? What is a successful outcome going to do for you here? Great. Here's what a successful outcome will do for me. Once I've got theirs and have made sure it's mutually understood, now I need to get mine in there too. And so it's a both and. This isn't just only paying attention and looking out for other people. It's looking out for all the needs of all the participants, including yourself.
Which is, I think, an important point because it is so easy to get caught in this, like, well, I'm going to lower the conflict by just focusing on them and let's try to get them what they want. But establishing and that intersection, like that synergy of what you want, what they want, finding the middle ground, and if not, if we're really like diametrically opposed, then we can still use these techniques to find a path forward. Like it's not always about. I think that's the thing is like, and I talk about this with yes and it's not like a magic thing where it's like, oh, we'll magically always find a solution that you were both super excited about. Like once in a while, I mean, sometimes and maybe frequently, depending on the type of work, like one person's gonna get their way, the other person's not. So how do these phrases or like what's your experience sort of managing that?
So, one of my favorite approaches to that reality of life, and that is a reality of life, is clarity, and specifically clarity around who owns which decisions. And as members of a team, as leaders, as executives, doesn't matter what our role is, if we can invest in clarity. So, who owns this decision? Let's say we're talking about something as a team. Who owns it? Is this going to be a vote where it's a majority rules? Is it consensus where we all need to be able to live with the outcome? Or is one person deciding? All three of those are justifiable, legitimate ways of making that decision.
Mm-hmm.
There are different times, different places. We're going to use all three of those. The key is that we establish before we get into the discussion who owns the decision. So if we can ask that, that's a great clarity phrase that you can ask no matter what your role, no matter what your job title is, doesn't matter. Hey, we're talking about this. Just quick clarifying question. Who owns this decision? Are you making the call, Avish? If so, then I'm going to try to participate to the best of my ability to persuade you. If we're voting, I'm going to try to persuade the team and figure out what I want to vote for. And if it's consensus, then we're going to be here a while we work through until we can all live with something. And so now I know how to engage and I also know how to let go.
Yeah, I remember when I ran an improv group for 7 years. We kind of get new members every time we audition, and like on the first meeting, I kind of lay out the rules of the group, and I would tell them like, look, I'm very open-minded, and I'm open to discussion. I'll listen to anything you say. At the end of the day, like I'm gonna ultimately make a decision, because it was like my group, I was running it, I owned it, I put all the outlay, but it was kind of like that. I gave them that clarity right up front, and we never had a conflict from that because people knew like, all right, and I think you're right, the clarity, and then when you go back to the tell me more with the connection, I find, and one thing I talk about is, if you actually connect with people and learn, like if I use the yes but obviously. If you come to me with your idea and I'm like, yeah, but we're gonna do it this way, you immediately feel conflict and disrespected. If I do yes and tell me more, and you feel like I really understood where you were coming from, what your position was, get the clarity on what you meant, reflect back, and then I say, David, here's what you're saying. This is the way we're going to do it. Here's why. You're going to be that rejection is going to feel much more positive to you.
And I would take that even a step further from and this is a tool out of Courageous Cultures. It's not specifically in powerful phrases, but when somebody brings an idea like that, three different things, three steps in our response. So one is gratitude. Let me start by saying thank you for bringing the idea in the first place. Doesn't matter the quality of the idea. It may be the strategically dumbest idea you've ever heard, but the fact that they cared enough to think about it and bring it to you,
Mm-hmm.
we want more of that. So let's encourage it. Like, hey, thank you so much for thinking about how we can get better, for caring. I really appreciate that. Then, when this is what you were doing, you were adding information to the conversation. So you got to tell me more, fully understand it.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Here's some additional information you might not be aware of. This other department has this priority, or strategically, this is where we're heading. Or, hey, that sounds like it may be something we can test. Let's test it out. Or, hey, sometimes we're already doing that. And here's where you could find out more about. So, whatever information we need to add, then we can wrap up that conversation by inviting them to keep thinking, keep contributing. And that's where we can coach their direction a little bit. So, like, back to your improv group, you're like, where we could really use a great idea? I need to figure out how to get everybody here on time. That's where we could use a,
Oh,
okay,
that's
or
so
whatever
good.
it
Yeah.
is, like where you need an idea, right? Or hey, you know what? We need more places to perform. So if you got any thoughts on that, I'd love to get your thoughts on where we can do some either some workshops or some stage perform or whatever it is. I'm just making stuff up. I'm sure your group had plenty of places to perform, but you know
Sure.
what I
Let's
mean.
say that.
It's that invitation to continue contributing, so we can build that out. And those are some more powerful phrases that aren't specifically in this book, but they are very powerful in terms of how
No,
you're
I love that
interlinking.
that redirecting, so you're not ending the conversation and shutting them down. I kind of use this. I don't talk about this a lot, maybe in a longer workshop, but there's yes and yes but. What invariably comes up when you have a longer discussion is the no but, which is like, no, we can't do this thing you're saying, but here's what we can do, or no, but why don't you move? And so when you combine that with the understanding, the reflecting, it's just, I like that idea of redirecting instead of just stopping the conversation because it keeps them involved and keeps them going forward. So let's talk about and we've already sort of we don't need to like kind of go line by line. We already mentioned a few of the phrases, but in clarity, I like for clarity the one I picked was what would be a successful outcome for you.
And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. What would a successful outcome do for you?
Oh, interesting.
And I know, and we started with an earlier iteration that was along the lines of what you were saying is, well, what's success look like, right? And we say that, and I say that all the time. So the reason that this one, as we really workshopped and what we're looking for here, is that when we say what would a successful outcome do for you, it gets beyond somebody's position, it gets beyond whatever their starting ask is, it gets beyond that tug of war over any of the things that are the surface things, and I find out what are they really needing to achieve. So let's say you and I are starting in on a project together. All right, Avish, what does success look like for you on this project? And what would success do for you? And you're like, you know what? I've got all the accolades I need. I'm happy with my position. I want to be home to see my kids. At the end of the day, I need to get home and see my kids and watch their sports or their theater or whatever. Okay, cool. That's you want to do good work and everything, but as part of a successful outcome of this project is you're home to see your kids. I say, great. Part of what a successful outcome would do for me is I'm really looking to distinguish myself with some meaningful projects because I really am after a promotion for this. So if we both know what we need out of this thing, now instead of arguing about when we're meeting or just getting into a tug of war, no, it needs to be 45 minutes. No, it needs to be an hour and a half. Now we're saying, okay, I know what you need. I know what I need. Let's start looking at some solutions that can meet both of those needs. We can't ever have that conversation if we don't know what those needs are in the first place. And so that's why that phrase, what would a successful outcome do for you, is so powerful. It gets under the surface, gets all the cards on the table, no hidden agendas. Now we can start solving things.
And they're also sort of connected, right? Because not only is that going to clarify, it's going to build connection. Because if I'm asking you what's an outcome we do for you, you're feeling like, oh, he actually cares about like what this means to me. So it's obviously you've broken them up to kind of keep them a little more focused, but they all sort of like that's why they're the goat phrases, right? It's not just like a single use; they all sort of feed into each other.
Absolutely.
Because building off of that, then both tell me more and what was successful outcome do for you are also phrases that sort of are lead to curiosity or are like kind of fill in that dimension, right? I forget which one you had said. You had mentioned one, but I went with what do you suggest we do next,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very self-serving. But in improv, I talk about it in my keynotes and workshops that like the moment an improviser is doing an improv game or story or scene is like, oh, here's where this story is going to end up, is like they're screwed. It's going to suck. But if they just focus on, all right, one next step, what do I do next? What do I say next? So focusing on one step at a time. So I like to be curious. It's like, all right, what do you suggest we do next? And just to kind of keep it very simple, but kind of again outwardly focused, what they think.
And from a relationship perspective, yeah, people are much more likely to take action on something that they own. So if you're getting that suggestion from them, it's even more powerful that way, as well as you were saying, reinforcing connection, reinforcing clarity. So they definitely work together.
Yeah, yeah. And then finally with commitment, we already talked about that. And for me, the curiosity phrase, what do you suggest we do next? Now it's not quite commitment because you haven't committed, but it's kind of the next step is, what's one action we can both, I forget the exact ending of like take or do or commit to. Um, And this is it's something I gotta get so much better at. And I don't even work with other people or lead a team, but just in like sales calls or check-in calls with gigs, like just getting that commitment of what are we gonna do and by when. It just a it's such a game changer.
It is such a game changer, and I call it scheduling the finish. But any conversation that I'm having where there's any kind of intent that I want to make sure we follow through on, when's it on the calendar for both of us? And that can be an accountability conversation. It can be an ideation conversation. It can be a getting together to have a beer conversation. It doesn't matter. Like whatever it is I'm investing in, if that intent is real and I mean it, let's get it on the calendar so that we've got a scheduled follow through. If we need to change it, we need to redo it, whatever, fine. But it makes it real and it defines it in a way that increases our accountability and builds trust. And then if there are exceptions or things happen or we're not able to follow through on it, now we've got a built-in time to talk about it, talk about what happened instead of just letting our trust erode because we never followed through.
And what's great is that I was gonna ask, like, well, what if you put something on the calendar, but then the person doesn't follow through and misses the meeting, and now you're back in that kind of ghosting slash vague phase. I'm like, oh wait, there's phrases in the book for how you like reach out to someone and like what do you say to them when you feel they've dropped the ball or weren't being accountable. And so the first level is all right, let's set a commitment, but then if they don't, then you've got solutions for what to do if they don't follow through.
Absolutely. There are, like you said, 20 some chapters of all different kinds of scenarios. So, including difficult coworkers, including navigating those tough conversations with your boss. If your boss is a micromanager, your boss isn't following through on their commitment. Like, what do you do? They won't make a decision. All sorts of different common workplace conflicts and specific phrases you can use.
Yeah, and again, we don't have time to go through all that in this. I want people to read the book because it is almost like a menu. Obviously, you can read the whole book, you have a lot of great ideas, but it's also very sort of like prescriptive. Like, ooh, I'm having this specific problem. Let me go to the table of contents, find that chapter, and go right to that. And we are kind of coming to the end of time, and so we talked pretty in depth about a lot of things. I want to ask about two other things that are not directly in the book but are related. I'm curious if you've heard of these or what your thought is, or if you talk about these. And they're both related, so I'll talk about them both. It sounds very much to me, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, that this type of communication builds psychological safety within teams and organizations. And along those lines, are you familiar with the concept, or have you heard of the phrase creative abrasion?
Hmm.
So that's what I was thinking a lot when I'm reading this, because I've been thinking about how my yes and can really help with psychological safety, and I talk about Pixar and creative abrasion, all this stuff. And I'm curious how you see, because when I read your book, I'm like, oh, this fits a lot in there. I'm curious if that's something you talk about at all, or if you kind of use that as a selling point, or for people who don't know what the heck I'm talking about, what does even psychological safety mean?
For sure. So I will address that. And in terms of scheduling the finish, I do have another call that I need to hop for. So I'm going to answer this one, then I'll need to get to that appointment.
Got it.
So, talking about psychological safety, Amy Edmondson from Harvard wrote the foreword to Courageous Cultures. And so she's, in many ways, one of the pioneers of the research around psychological safety. And it's basically defined at the level of a group or a team. Does everybody in that group feel comfortable to speak up, to share their truth, to share their perspective without fear of reprisal and all the rest? And so, 100%, these phrases are ways to help individual people, for you as a listener, to be a contributor to psychological safety on your team and help to create that not only for yourself, but also for your teammates. And when you do that, then you get the benefit of, Avish, what you're talking about, of the creative abrasion, of the ability to bounce different ideas and build something that is more than the sum of its parts. And that's what I love most about leadership and teamwork, and all of it is when it's at its best, we are doing something more than any one of us could do individually. And that's a magical thing.
Yeah, and that is exactly, I think, what your book sort of helps people get to. Initiate the conflict for long-term stability and better environments, better cultures, kind of like the other book you wrote about. So fantastic. Well, yeah, we are at the end of time. You got another call. So just real quick, if people want to contact you or learn more about you and your work and the stuff you and Karen do together and the book, how should they find you and reach you?
So the book is available anywhere books are sold. And since you're a podcast listener, I will tell you that Karen and I narrate it if you like the audio version of things. So the audiobook is actually the best, so surprising to me, the best-selling version. It's selling well in all versions, but it's paperback, Kindle, ebook, whatever platform you use. So that's available everywhere. You want to learn more about us? Let'sgrowleaders.com, and you can find out all the ways that we can help you there. But that's where you can go to learn more.
Fantastic. And we will link to all that in the show notes and on the blog post for this. David, thank you very, very much. Super appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, we'll have you back on. We got more to talk about. We didn't get into the fantasy novel yet, so we'll the storybook. So we'll have you back and we'll talk more.
That would be several shows worth of conversation, I'm sure. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for
All
having me.
right. Thanks, David.
All right, cheers.